Forbidden love shakes billionaire empire. The story no one expected. When Leah Goldstein, heiress to one of New York's largest real estate empires, announced her engagement to David Cohen, an unknown artist from Brooklyn, no one could have imagined the earthquake that was to come. Samuel Goldstein, family patriarch and ruthless tycoon, sets his future son-in-law an impossible challenge: prove his worth in 3 months or lose Leah forever. But what was supposed to be a simple test turns into a plot of betrayal, dark secrets, and a conspiracy that threatens to destroy everything the Goldsteins have built. As David struggles to win his father-in-law's approval, he finds himself at the center of a corporate scandal that could cost billions. His mysterious connection to the Goldstein company's past comes to light, putting his love for Leah to the test. With shocking twists and turns, unexpected alliances, and a breathtaking climax, this story shows that in the world of the super-rich, love can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Get ready to dive into a world of luxury, power, and passion, where nothing is as it seems and everyone has something to hide. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The sun was setting over Manhattan, bathing the Goldsteins' luxurious penthouse apartment in golden hues. Samuel Goldstein, a middle-aged man with gray hair and shrewd eyes, was adjusting his silk tie in front of the mirror. His reflection revealed not only his impeccable suit, but also decades of determination and success. "Rachel, is Leah here yet?" he called, his voice echoing through the marble corridors. Rachel, his wife, appeared at the bedroom door. "She's in the dining room, dear." "She looks nervous," Samuel frowned. "Leah? Nervous?" His only daughter, always so confident and determined. What could be upsetting her? Family dinner was a sacred tradition for the Goldsteins, but tonight there was a palpable tension in the air. Leah, a 28-year-old with the same piercing eyes as her father, was stirring the food on her plate, barely touching the delicacy prepared by the family's private chef. "So, daughter," Samuel began, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "how are the preparations for the gallery exhibition going?" Leah looked up, meeting her father's curious gaze. "They're fine, Dad, but there's something I need to tell you." Rachel put down the cutlery, her motherly intuition alerting her. "What is it, darling? You look worried." Leah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I am engaged." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Rachel blinked several times, as if trying to process the information. "Fiancé?" Samuel finally managed to say, his voice a mixture of surprise and incredulity. "To whom?" "His name is David," Leah replied, her voice gaining confidence. "We met a few months ago at the gallery. He's an incredible artist, Dad. I'm sure you'll love him." Samuel put down his fork, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "An artist? And why are we only hearing about him now? Because—" Leah hesitated, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Because I knew you'd react that way. David doesn't come from a rich family, Dad. He works hard, he's talented, but he's poor," Samuel added, his voice laced with disapproval. Rachel put a hand on her husband's arm, trying to calm him down. "Samuel, let's hear what Leah has to say. Honey, tell us more about David." Leah straightened up in her chair, her eyes shining with determination. "David is intelligent, kind, and has a unique view of the world. He makes me happy, Mom. Isn't that what matters?" Samuel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "What matters is the future, Leah. The future I've built for you." "How can you throw all that away for a penniless artist?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Leah replied, her voice rising to match her father's. "I'm choosing to be happy." "I thought that's what you wanted for me." "Happiness?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "Happiness doesn't pay the bills, Leah. It doesn't guarantee stability. Do you think I built all this by being happy?" Rachel intervened. her soft voice contrasting with the tension in the air. "Samuel, please. Let's talk about this calmly." But Samuel was already pacing back and forth, his mind working furiously. "No, Rachel. This is crazy. Leah, you can't marry this man. I forbid it." Leah stood up, facing her father. "You can't forbid me anything, Dad. I'm an adult, and that's my decision." "Your decision?" Samuel turned around, his eyes sparking. "Very well. So here's my decision. If you marry this David, you can forget about your inheritance. Everything I've built, everything I've planned for you, is over." Shock crossed Leah's face, but was quickly replaced by determination. "If that's how you feel, Dad, then maybe I should go." Rachel stood up, tears in her eyes. "Leah, no, Samuel, please, let's talk about this." But Samuel had already made up his mind. No, let her go. But first. He turned to Leah, his eyes hard as steel. "I want to meet this. David, bring him here tomorrow night. I want to see for myself the man you think is worthy of my daughter." Leah hesitated for a moment, then nodded rigidly. "All right, Dad, tomorrow night. But don't expect that to change anything." With one last look at her mother, Leah left the dining room, leaving behind a heavy silence full of unspoken emotions. Samuel turned to the window, watching the city lights. His mind was already formulating plans, determined to protect everything he had built, even if it meant facing his own daughter. The Goldsteins' family dinner was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The elevator rose silently through the floors of the luxurious building. David Cohen, a young man in his 30s with messy dark hair and intense brown eyes, nervously adjusted the collar of his newly bought shirt. Next to him, Leah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, but the tension in her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. The elevator doors opened, revealing the foyer of the Goldsteins' apartment. David swallowed, feeling immediately out of place among the polished marble and expensive works of art. "Ready?" Leah asked, her hand on the doorknob. David nodded, gathering his courage. "Ready." The door opened, and they entered the apartment. Samuel and Rachel were waiting for them in the living room, a picture of wealth and sophistication against the backdrop of New York City, visible through the huge windows. Samuel stood up, his critical gaze assessing David from head to toe. "So, you're David," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "Yes, sir," David replied, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Goldstein." Samuel ignored the outstretched hand, gesturing for them to sit down. Rachel cast a disapproving glance at her husband before approaching with a forced smile. "Welcome, David," she said, briefly shaking his hand. "Please, sit down." As they settled down, the contrast between David and his surroundings became even more apparent. His shirt, although new, looked cheap compared to Samuel's tailored suits. His shoes, slightly worn, stood out from the immaculate floor. "So, David," Samuel began, leaning forward in his leather armchair, "Leah tells me you're an artist." David nodded, trying to keep his composure under Samuel's penetrating gaze. "Yes, sir. I'm a painter and I also work with installations." Samuel murmured, his tone making it clear that he didn't consider this a respectable profession. "And how exactly do you plan to support my daughter with art?" Leah shifted uncomfortably, but David remained calm. "I have a few exhibitions scheduled in the coming months, Mr. Goldstein, and I also teach art at a community school." Samuel laughed humorlessly. "Exhibitions and classes. Fascinating. And where do you live, David?" "Certainly not in Manhattan. I live in Brooklyn, sir," David replied, feeling the blush creep up his neck. "I have a small studio that serves as my studio and home." Rachel intervened, trying to ease the tension. "That sounds charming, David. It must be inspiring for your work." But Samuel wasn't interested in amenities. "Let me be blunt, David." "What do?" "You have to offer my daughter? How can you guarantee that she'll have the life she's used to?" David looked at Leah, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Goldstein, I understand your concern. I know I can't offer Leah the kind of material life you've provided, but I can offer love, respect, and partnership. I will work tirelessly to build a future for us." Samuel stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. "Love and respect don't pay bills, boy. They don't buy security." "Dad?" Leah interjected, her voice firm. "David is talented and dedicated. He'll succeed, I'm sure." Samuel turned, his eyes shining with a sudden idea. "Well, if you're so sure of his potential, how about a challenge?" Silence fell over the room. David straightened up, sensing that this was the crucial moment. "What kind of challenge, sir?" 3 months, Samuel declared. "I'm giving you 3 months to prove yourself. Show me that you can succeed, that you can provide a decent life for my daughter. If you succeed, I'll give you my blessing. If you fail..." He left the sentence hanging in the air, the implied threat hanging between them. Leah stood up, indignant. "Dad, this is ridiculous." "You can't." But David interrupted her, his eyes fixed on Samuel. "I accept." The room fell silent. Rachel looked from David to Samuel, concern evident on her face. Leah seemed torn between pride and fear. Samuel, for his part, seemed surprised and slightly impressed by David's quick acceptance. "Very well," he said at last. 3 months from today. Impress me, David Cohen." As David and Leah prepared to leave, the tension in the room was palpable. Rachel accompanied them to the door, whispering an apology. In the elevator, Leah turned to David, her eyes full of emotion. "You didn't have to." "Accept that, David. We don't have to prove anything to him." David smiled softly, taking Leah's hands in his. "I know, but I want to do this. For us." As the elevator descended, bringing them back to reality outside the Goldsteins' ivory tower, David knew that the next 3 months would be the most challenging of his life. But looking at Leah, he was sure it was worth the fight. The sun had barely risen when David woke up, sitting on the edge of his bed in the small studio in Brooklyn. His eyes roamed the cramped space, filled with canvases, brushes, and cans of paint. This was his world, his creative refuge. But now it was also the starting point for the biggest challenge of his life. Leah walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, handing one to David. He accepted the cup with a tired smile. "Not much. I've been thinking about how I'm going to prove myself to your father." Leah sat down next to him, her hands wrapping around the warm cup. "David, you don't have to prove anything. We can just ignore this ridiculous challenge and move on." David shook his head. "No, Leah. I know how much your family means to you. I want to do this right." As they sipped their coffee, David's mind wandered back to the day he met Leah, 6 months ago. It was a rainy fall afternoon. David was setting up his new installation in the gallery when Leah walked in, shaking a wet umbrella. "Sorry," I thought. "The gallery was open," she said, turning to leave. David, covered in paint and dust, smiled. "Technically it's not, but you're welcome to have a look around first." Leah hesitated, then smiled back. "Well, since I'm here." They spent the next hour, chatting about art, life, and dreams. David was enchanted by Leah's passion for curating, and she found herself fascinated by his unique view of the world. "You know," Leah said, looking at one of David's pieces, "there's something special about your art. It's like you see beyond the surface of things." David blushed slightly. "Thank you. That's exactly what I try to do. To see the beauty in the ordinary, the extraordinary in the everyday." At that moment, something clicked between them, a connection that transcended words. Back in the present, David stood up, determined. "I'm going to start today. I have some ideas for a new series of paintings that might catch the eye of some important galleries. Leah watched him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Just don't forget to take care of yourself in the process, okay? David nodded, kissing her softly. I promise. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. David painted as if his life depended on it, and in a way, it did. His evenings were spent emailing galleries, curators, and collectors. A month after starting the challenge, David received an unexpected phone call. Mr. Cohen, a female voice, sounded on the other end of the line. This is Sophia Reeves, from the Reeves Gallery in Chelsea. We're interested in including some of your work in our next exhibition. David's heart raced. The Reeves Gallery was known for launching promising artists. That would be incredible, Ms. Reeves. When can we meet? How about tomorrow at 2 p.m.? And please bring some of your latest pieces. After hanging up, David immediately called Leah. Iva. Got a meeting at the Reeves Gallery, she exclaimed, barely able to contain her excitement. David, that's wonderful, Leah replied, her voice full of pride. See, I told you your talent would be recognized. The next day, David walked into the Reeves Gallery carrying 3 of his best recent pieces. Sophia Reeves, an elegant middle-aged woman, welcomed him with a professional smile. Mr. Cohen, it's a pleasure to meet you in person, she said, leading him into a conference room. Show me what you've brought. David carefully unwrapped his paintings, explaining the concept behind each one. Sophia listened intently, her experienced eyes evaluating each brushstroke. Impressive, she finally said. There is a depth to your work. That is rare to see in such young artists. David's heart leapt. So, do you think there might be a space for me in the exhibition? Sophia smiled. Better than that. I'd like to offer you a solo exhibition in 2 months' time. Your works would be the main focus. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. A solo show at the Reeves Gallery was more than he could have dreamed of. That's incredible, he managed to say. Thank you, Mrs. Reeves. You won't regret it. As he left the gallery, David felt a mixture of elation and anxiety. This could be just what he needed to prove his worth to Samuel. But it also meant enormous pressure to create a body of work worthy of a solo exhibition in just 2 months. That evening, as he shared the good news with Leah over a simple dinner in his studio, David couldn't help wondering what Samuel would say. Would that be enough to impress him? I'm so proud of you, Leah said, her eyes shining. This is just the beginning, David. You'll see. David smiled, squeezing her hand. Thank you for believing in me, Leah. I don't know what I'd do without you. As they prepared for bed, David looked at the blank canvases stacked in the corner of the studio. The real challenge was just beginning. He had 2 months to create the collection of his life and perhaps secure his future with Leah. Samuel Goldstein's office at the top of a skyscraper in Manhattan offered a panoramic view of the city. But that morning, his eyes were fixed on a folder on his desk. Daniel Stern, his trusted private investigator, was sitting on the other side, waiting anxiously. So, Samuel said, leafing through the documents. What did you find out about this? David Cohen? Daniel leaned forward. Well, Mr. Goldstein, at first glance, he seems to be exactly what he says he is, an up-and-coming artist, living modestly in Brooklyn. But, Samuel raised an eyebrow, but there are some inconsistencies in his past, gaps that I haven't been able to fill in completely. Just then, the office door opened abruptly. Leah walked in, her eyes sparking with anger. How could you, Dad? She demanded, throwing an identical folder onto the desk. Hire a private investigator to spy on David. Samuel stood up, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. How did you? Your secretary called me by mistake thinking I should receive these documents, Leah replied, her voice shaking with emotion. I can't believe you would do that. Daniel, sensing the tension, mumbled an excuse, and quickly left the office. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "Leah, you have to understand. I'm just trying to protect you. Protect me." Leah laughed bitterly. "Or protect your precious empire." "Both," Samuel replied, his voice softening. "Leah, sit down, please." Reluctantly, Leah sat down. Samuel went around the table, leaning on it in front of his daughter. "When I was David's age," he began, his eyes distant, "I had nothing. Absolutely nothing." Leah looked at her father, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood in the Bronx," Samuel continued. "My parents were immigrants, working in factories. I saw how much they struggled, how much they suffered. I promised myself that one day I would give my family everything they never had." He paused, looking out of the window at the city he had conquered. "Every penny I earned, every deal I closed, every building I built. It was all to make sure you never knew the poverty I did." Leah felt her anger subside, replaced by a reluctant understanding. "Dad, I understand that you want to protect me, but David is not a threat. He's talented, hard-working, and he has..." "Secrets," Samuel interrupted, pointing to the folder. "There are parts of his past that don't add up. Do you really know him, Leah?" Leah hesitated, a seed of doubt planted in her mind. I trust him, Dad," Samuel nodded slowly. "Trust is good, but verification is better. I just want to make sure he is who he says he is." Just then, Leah's phone rang. It was David. "Hi, love," she answered, trying to keep her voice calm. "What's up?" "Leah, you won't believe it." David's voice was full of excitement. "The Reeves Gallery wants to hold a solo exhibition of my work. In 2 months." Leah's face lit up, her worry momentarily forgotten. "David, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you." After hanging up, she turned to her father, a triumphant smile on her face. "See, David is making a success of himself. He doesn't need your money or approval." Samuel looked thoughtful. "A solo show at the Reeves Gallery is impressive, I admit, but 2 months is very little time to prepare an entire collection." "David can do it," Leah said confidently. "You'll see." As Leah left the office, Samuel found himself torn between reluctant admiration for David's success and a growing suspicion about his mysterious past. That evening, in David's small studio in Brooklyn, Leah watched him furiously working on a new painting. His hands were smeared with paint, his face concentrated as he applied quick, precise strokes to the canvas. "David," Leah began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, love," he replied, without taking his eyes off the canvas. Leah took a deep breath. Is there something from your past that you haven't told me?" David's brush stopped in midair. He turned slowly, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "Why are you asking that?" Leah looked away, guilty. "My father, he's hired an investigator. I know, it's terrible, but..." David put down his brush, wiping his hands on a cloth. "And what did this investigator find?" "Nothing concrete," Leah answered quickly. "Just gaps, things that don't make sense." David was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a distant point. When he spoke, his voice was low and charged with emotion. "There are things from my past that I'm not proud of, Leah. Things I'd rather leave behind." Leah moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "You can tell me anything, David. I love you." David looked her in the eye, an internal battle clear on his face. I need time. Please trust me." Leah nodded, hugging him tightly, but as she hugged him, she couldn't help feeling that something had changed between them. A shadow of doubt hung in the air, threatening the happiness they had built. Across town, in his office, Samuel Goldstein stared at the phone, struggling. Finally, he made up his mind and dialed a number. "Daniel, it's Samuel. I need you to dig deeper into David Cohen's past, no matter what the cost." Find out everything you can. As night fell over New York, 3 people in different parts of the city were caught up in their own whirlwinds of emotions. Leah, torn between love and doubt. David, struggling with the ghosts of his past. And Samuel, determined to uncover the truth, no matter what the consequences. The 3-month challenge had become much more than a simple test of mettle. Now it was a race against time, with secrets threatening to come to light and change everything. David's studio was an organized mess. Canvases in various stages of completion occupied every available inch, the smell of fresh paint permeating the air. At the center of this creative whirlwind, David worked tirelessly, his eyes focused and his hands steady despite the hours without. Sleep, a knock on the door, snapped him out of his artistic trance. It was Leah, carrying a bag of takeaway food. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, a forced smile on her face. David put down his brush, suddenly realizing how hungry he was. "You're an angel," he said, kissing her softly. As they ate in silence, the tension between them was palpable. Finally, Leah spoke. "David, what we talked about the other night." David sighed, putting his fork aside. "I know you deserve explanations, Leah. It's complicated." "Try explaining it to me," Leah insisted gently. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." David was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a distant point. When he finally spoke, his voice was charged with emotion. "Before I became an artist, I made some bad choices. I was involved with dangerous people. I did things I'm not proud of." Leah held her breath, her heart racing. "What kind of things?" "I forged works of art," David confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "I was young, stupid, and desperate for money. I thought my talent could be used for, well, evil." Leah stood in shock, trying to process the information. "For how long?" "2 years," David replied, finally looking her in the eye. "Until I got caught. I spent 6 months in prison." The silence that followed was deafening. Leah stood up, walking over to the window, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. David joined her at the window, his reflection pale and anguished. "Because I was afraid of losing you, afraid that you would see me differently. Those years, they're not who I am." "Now, Leah, I've changed." Leah turned to him, tears in her eyes. "I believe you, David. But my father, if he finds out—" "Hell find out," a deep voice interrupted. They both turned, surprised, to see Samuel Goldstein standing in the doorway of the studio, Daniel Stern a few steps behind him. "Dad," Leah exclaimed, "what are you doing here?" Samuel entered the studio, his eyes roaming over the paintings before settling on David Ive, come to meet the real David Cohen. The forger, the criminal. David stepped forward, placing himself between Leah and Samuel. "Mr. Goldstein, I can explain." "Explain." Samuel laughed humorlessly. "Explain how you tricked my daughter, how you plan to use your talent to take advantage of our family. It's nothing like that." Leah intervened, positioning herself next to David. "Dad, David has changed. He's a legitimate artist now." Samuel shook his head, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Leah, don't you see? As a liar, a criminal. How can we trust anything he says or does?" David took a deep breath, meeting Samuel's gaze. "Mr. Goldstein, I understand your anger and mistrust. What I did in the past was wrong, and I paid for it. But since then, I've worked hard to redeem myself, to be the man Leah deserves." Samuel looked at the surrounding paintings, his gaze softening momentarily. "I must admit, your work is impressive, but that doesn't change the fact that you lied to my daughter, to me." Leah stepped forward, taking David's hand. "Dad, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to live after them. David chose the right path. He deserves a second chance. Samuel was silent for a long moment, his gaze alternating between David and Leah. Finally, he spoke. "You still have a month and a half left on our original agreement, Mr. Cohen. Use it wisely. Prove that you've really changed, that you're worthy of my daughter. And if there are any more secrets..." He let the threat hang in the air. With that, Samuel turned to leave, pausing briefly at the door. "Leah, the final decision will be yours. But remember, sometimes love isn't enough." After Samuel left, the studio fell silent. David and Leah looked at each other, a mixture of relief and apprehension on their faces. "I'm sorry," David said softly, "for not telling you sooner, for putting you in this position." Leah hugged him tightly. "We're in this together, David. No matter what." As the sun set over Brooklyn, casting long shadows across the studio, David and Leah remained in each other's arms. The challenge now was greater than ever. It wasn't just about proving David's artistic worth, but about rebuilding trust and showing that people really can change. David looked at his unfinished paintings, a renewed determination in his eyes. This exhibition wouldn't just be about art, it would be his redemption, his chance to prove to Samuel and to himself that he really had changed. The clock was ticking, and the real test was just beginning. Samuel Goldstein's office was immersed in a tense silence. He stared at the computer screen, his face a mask of worry. Rachel, sitting on the other side of the desk, watched her husband with apprehension. "Samuel, what's going on?" she finally asked. He sighed deeply, turning the screen so she could see. "We're in trouble, Rachel. Serious trouble." On the screen, screaming headlines announced a scandal involving one of Samuel's biggest companies, the Goldstein Development Corporation. Accusations of bribery and irregularities in government contracts threatened to crumble the empire he had built over decades. "That can't be true," Rachel muttered, shocked. "It's not," Samuel replied, his voice laden with frustration. "But the mere accusation is already causing damage. Our stock has plummeted, partners are walking away, and the press is having a field day." Just then, the office door opened and Leah walked in, her face pale with worry. "Dad, I've just seen the news. What can we do?" Samuel stood up, walking over to the window. "I don't know, dear. Our legal department is working on it, but it could take months to clear our name. Until then..." Leah's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was David. "Leah, have you seen the news about your father?" David's voice sounded worried on the other end of the line. "Yes, I'm in his office now," she replied. "It's a nightmare, David." There was a pause on the other end, then David said, "Leah, I think I can help." "How?" Leah asked. Puzzled. "During my past..." David hesitated. "I met people who work in corporate investigations, people who are experts in uncovering the truth behind scandals like this." Leah looked at her father, who was now watching her curiously. "David says he can help," she said, putting the phone on speaker. Samuel frowned. "And how exactly could you help, Mr. Cohen?" David took a deep breath before replying. "Mr. Goldstein, I know people who can investigate this discreetly. Find the source of the accusations. Find out if there's any truth in them, or if it's a deliberate attempt to sabotage your company." Silence reigned in the office for a few moments. Samuel exchanged glances with Rachel and Leah before speaking. "Mr. Cohen, I appreciate the offer, but I must remind you that we are talking about a multi-million-dollar company. This is not a game." "I understand perfectly, sir," David replied, his voice firm. "I'm not treating this as a game. I'm offering you a real chance to find out the truth and clear your company's name." Leah intervened. "Dad, I think we should consider it. What have we got to lose?" Samuel pondered for a moment, then nodded. Slowly. "Very well, Mr. Cohen, you have my attention. What exactly do you propose?" Over the next few hours, David explained his plan. He would work with a team of specialized investigators, using contacts and methods that operated in the shadows of the corporate world. It was risky, potentially illegal in some respects, but it promised quick results. "If this goes wrong," Samuel warned, "it could make our situation even worse." "I understand the risks," David replied, "and am willing to take them myself. If something goes wrong, it'll just be up to me." Leah looked at David, a mixture of pride and fear in her eyes. "David, are you sure about this?" He nodded, determined. "Absolutely. It's my chance to prove myself, to show that I've really changed." Samuel studied David for a long moment before holding out his hand. "Very well, Mr. Cohen. You have my permission to proceed. But remember, the future of my company and potentially my family is in your hands." David shook Samuel's hand, the weight of responsibility evident on his face. "I won't let you down, Mr. Goldstein." In the days that followed, David plunged headlong into the investigation. His studio became a makeshift operations center, with pictures and paintings giving way to maps, documents, and computers. Leah helped him whenever she could, impressed by his dedication and skill. A week later, late at night, David made a shocking discovery. He rushed to the Goldsteins' apartment, where Samuel, Rachel, and Leah were waiting anxiously. "I've found something," David announced, panting. "The accusations, they're coming from within. Someone in your own company is trying to bring you down, Mr. Goldstein." The shock was visible on everyone's face. Samuel stood up, his voice trembling slightly. Who would do that?" David hesitated, glancing at Leah. "Before answering, it's complicated, sir. The person behind it is someone very close to you." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and fear of the unknown. Samuel looked at his family, then at David, the realization setting in that nothing would be the same after tonight. "Show me everything you've got," Samuel finally said, his voice firm despite the circumstances. "It's time we faced this head-on." As David began to explain his findings, the sun rose over New York, marking the beginning of a new day and possibly a new era for the Goldstein family. The challenge that had begun as a test for David had turned into something much bigger, something that could change the fate of everyone involved forever. Samuel Goldstein's office, once a symbol of power and success, now looked like a besieged fortress. The shutters were closed, isolating the room from the outside world that seemed to be conspiring against them. Samuel, Leah, David, and Rachel were gathered around, their tense expressions reflecting the gravity of the situation. "So," Samuel began, his voice tired, "you say the traitor is among us. Who are the suspects, David?" David hesitated, looking at the anxious faces around him. "Based on the evidence we've collected, there are three main possibilities." He stood up, walking over to a makeshift whiteboard where he had pasted photos and documents. "First, there's Robert Kensington, their CFO. He has access to all the financial information and could easily manipulate data to create this crisis." Samuel frowned. "Robert, he's been with me for 20 years. Why would he do that?" "Money," David replied simply. "We discovered suspicious transfers to an offshore account in his name." Leah intervened, her voice trembling. "Who else, David?" David pointed to another photo. "Sarah Goldstein, your cousin, Samuel. As vice president of operations, she would have had enough knowledge to orchestrate this, and she always resented not having a more central role in the company." Rachel gasped. "Sarah, but she's family." "Sometimes family can be our worst enemy," Samuel muttered, his expression grim. David hesitated before revealing the last suspect. And finally, Michael Goldstein, her son. The silence that followed was deafening. Leah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No, that's impossible. Michael would never do that to us." Samuel remained silent, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. Rachel covered her face with her hands, silent tears running down her cheeks. David continued, his voice soft but firm. Michael has reasons. He has always felt slighted in favor of Leah. And recently, he made big investments that failed. He's desperate for money. Samuel finally spoke, his voice hoarse. How can we be sure? How do we find out who's really behind this? David exchanged a look with Leah before replying, I have a plan, but it's risky and will need the cooperation of all of you. Over the next few hours, David detailed his strategy. They would spread false information to each of the suspects. Unique. Information that, if leaked, would reveal the culprit. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where trust would be tested to the limit. While the others discussed the details, Leah pulled David into a corner. Are you sure about this? She whispered, her eyes full of concern. If something goes wrong. David hugged her, feeling the trembling in his body. I know the risks, Leah, but it's our best chance to save your family and the company. Across the room, Samuel watched the interaction between his daughter and David. His expression was a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Part of him was still struggling to accept that this young man, with his questionable past, could be the key to saving everything he had built. As the night progressed, the plan took shape. Each member of the family was given their task, each aware of the weight of their actions in the days to come. The tension in the air was palpable, mixed with a fierce determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the sun began to rise, tinging the New York sky with shades of pink and gold, the group split up. David was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back. Samuel caught up with him, putting a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Cohen, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, regardless of the outcome, I thank you for what you're doing. David nodded solemnly. I'll do my best, Mr. Goldstein, for your family, for Leah, and to prove that I deserve your trust. As David rode down the elevator, his mind was in turmoil. The plan was in motion, but the variables were many. Over the next few days, secrets would be revealed, loyalties tested, and everyone's future would be at stake. Leah was waiting for him in the lobby, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. Are we really doing this? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. David hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Yes, we are, together. As they headed out into the blustery New York morning, they both knew that nothing would be the same after the next few days. The challenge that had begun as a test of David's mettle had turned into something much bigger, something that could redefine the fate of the entire Goldstein family. The game was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The clock on the wall of Samuel Goldstein's office seemed to move with agonizing slowness. 3 days had passed since David's plan had been put into action, and the tension was palpable in the air. Samuel, sitting behind his desk, stared at his phone. Nothing yet, he muttered, running a hand through his gray hair. Leah, who was standing by the window, turned to her father. Maybe it's a good sign. Maybe. No one has taken the bait. Just then, the office door opened abruptly. David entered, his face a mixture of triumph and apprehension. We've got something, he announced, placing a laptop on Samuel's desk. Rachel, who was sitting quietly in the corner, approached, curiosity overcoming her fear. What have you found? David opened the computer, revealing a series of emails and bank transfers. The false information we planted about a new development project in Dubai. It leaked. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes quickly scanning the information on the screen. And who? Sarah, David replied, his voice deep. Your cousin, Mr. Goldstein. She tried to sell the information to one of your biggest competitors. The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. Sarah. How could she? Leah put a comforting hand on her father's shoulder. Dad, I'm so sorry." Rachel, with tears in her eyes, spoke softly. "I always thought she resented not having a more central role in the company. But this is unforgivable." David continued. "It's not just that. We discovered that Sarah was working with someone from the outside. Someone with a keen interest in seeing the Goldstein Corporation fall." "Who?" Samuel demanded, his voice regaining its usual strength. David hesitated, exchanging a meaningful glance with Leah before replying, "Victor Roth." The name dropped like a bomb in the office. Victor Roth was an old rival of Samuel's, a real estate tycoon who had been trying to outdo the Goldstein Corporation for years. "That bastard," Samuel growled, slamming his fist on the table. "He's always wanted to bring me down and to use my own family against me. That's low, even for him." Leah, realizing the gravity of the situation, asked, "What do we do now?" David took a deep breath. "We have enough evidence to expose Sarah and Roth. But..." He hesitated, looking directly at Samuel. "There's something else you need to know." David's tone made everyone turn to him, apprehensive. "During my investigation, I discovered something about my own past. Something that has a direct bearing on all of this." Samuel stood up, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What are you talking about, Mr. Cohen?" David closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. When he opened them, his gaze met Leah's, full of love and fear. "Years ago, before I became an artist, I worked for Victor Roth." Leah gasped, her eyes widening in surprise. "David, what are you saying?" "I was young and stupid," David continued, his voice shaking. "Roth used me for some of his dirty business, including an earlier attempt to sabotage the Goldstein Corporation." Samuel stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "You knew about this all along? Have you been deceiving us all along?" "No!" David exclaimed, taking a step back. "I swear, I didn't know Roth was involved in this until now. When I realized the connection, You what?" Samuel interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "Decided it was time to confess. Or are you trying to get away with it before we find out the truth on our own?" Leah put herself between David and her. "Father, Dad, please, let him explain." David, his face pale, continued, "Mr. Goldstein, I understand your anger, but I swear on my life, I'm on your side now. Everything I've done in the last few days has been to help your family and your company." Rachel, who had been watching in silence until then, spoke up. "Samuel, maybe we should listen to him. After all, it was David who found out about Sarah and Roth." Samuel hesitated, the conflict evident on his face. Finally, he turned to David, his eyes hard as steel. "You have 5 minutes to convince me that you're not part of this conspiracy, Mr. Cohen. After that, I'll decide whether or not to call the police." The air in the office was thick with tension. David looked at Leah, searching for strength in her eyes, before beginning his explanation. Every word that came out of his mouth seemed to weigh tons, laden with regret, fear, and above all, hope. As David spoke, revealing the dark details of his past and how it connected with the present, the sun began to set over New York. The shadows lengthened in the office, symbolizing the revelations that threatened to engulf everyone present. As David's narrative drew to a close, a knock on the door interrupted the tense moment. Everyone turned in surprise as the door opened, revealing an unexpected figure. "I think I'm just in time for the big reveal," said the familiar voice, making everyone freeze in shock. The newcomer entered the room, an enigmatic smile on his face, bringing with him the promise of more twists and revelations that would change the course of everything they thought they knew. The silence in Samuel Goldstein's office was broken by the sound of the new arrival's firm footsteps. Michael Goldstein, Samuel's son, entered the room with an air of confidence that contrasted with the palpable tension in the room. "Michael?" Rachel exclaimed, her voice a mixture of surprise and relief. What are you doing here? Michael smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. I've come for the grand finale, of course. After all, it's not every day that we see the great. Samuel Goldstein cornered. Samuel stood up abruptly, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. Son, what are you talking about? David stepped forward, his posture tense. Mr. Goldstein, I think we've just found our last piece of the puzzle. Michael applauded sarcastically. Bravo, Mr. Cohen. Or should I say, David? You've proved to be smarter than I thought. Leah, who until then had been watching in shock, finally found her voice. Michael, you're behind all this? Not alone, dear sister, Michael replied, his tone condescending. I had help, of course. Sarah was helpful, although a little careless in the end. And as for our friend Victor Roth, well, he was more than happy to join us. Samuel staggered, leaning on his desk. Why, Michael? Why would you do this to us? To me? Michael's expression hardened. Why? Because you've never seen me, Dad. You were always the precious Leah, the perfect heiress. I was just the spare son, good enough to do the heavy lifting, but never to lead. That's not true, Rachel protested, tears in her eyes. We've always loved you both equally. Love? Michael sneered. Love doesn't build empires, Mom. Power does. And since I couldn't have it here, I decided to create my own. David, who had been watching intently, said, That's why you hired me years ago, isn't it? To start undermining the company from the inside. Michael smiled coldly. Very perceptive, David. Yes, you were a useful pawn at the time. Who'd have thought you'd come back to be the hero? Leah, recovering from her initial shock, confronted her. Brother, how could you, Michael? Destroy everything our family has built. I didn't destroy anything, Leah, Michael retorted. I just redrew the board. The Goldstein Corporation will fall, yes, but out of the ashes will rise something new, something of my own. Samuel, who had been silent, processing everything, finally spoke, his voice charged with emotion. Michael, son, if you felt that way, why didn't you talk to me? We could have sorted it out together. For a moment, Michael's mask of coolness faltered. Talk? Since when do you really listen to me, Dad? At that moment, David stepped forward. Mr. Goldstein, there's something you need to know. The real reason I'm here. All eyes turned to David, the tension in the air almost palpable. When you set me that challenge, it wasn't just about proving my worth to Leah, was it? David asked, looking directly at Samuel. Samuel hesitated, then nodded slowly. No, it wasn't. I knew something was wrong in the company. I needed someone from the outside, someone with a questionable past to investigate. Leah gasped. Dad, did you use David? And you knew all this? Michael asked, his confidence shaken for the first time. Samuel shook his head. Not everything. I suspected a conspiracy, but I never imagined. I never thought that my own son. The silence that followed was deafening. Each person in the room was absorbing the revelations, the lies, the manipulations that had shaped their lives over the last few months. Finally, David broke the silence. Mr. Goldstein, I accepted your challenge not only to prove my worth, but to redeem myself, to show that I could use my skills for good. Leah approached David, taking his hand. And you did it, David. You unraveled everything. Michael, seeing his plan fall apart, made a move towards the door. This isn't over. You can't prove anything. But before he could leave, the door opened again. 2 policemen entered, followed by Daniel Stern, Samuel's private investigator. Actually, Mr. Goldstein Jr., said one of the officers, we have all the evidence we need. You're under arrest. As Michael was led away, protesting and threatening, the weight of events fell on everyone in the room. Samuel sank into his chair, seeming to age years in minutes. Rachel sobbed silently, consoled by Leah. David, feeling the weight of the moment, approached Samuel. "Mr. Goldstein, I'm sorry about all this. I know it wasn't what you expected when you gave me that challenge." Samuel looked at David, his eyes tired but clear. "No, Mr. Cohen, it wasn't what I expected. It was much more." He held out his hand. "Not only did you save my company, but you also opened my eyes. Thank you." As David shook Samuel's hand, Leah joined them, hugging both men. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But as the sun set over New York, casting long shadows across the office, everyone knew that although one battle was over, the war to rebuild both the company and the family was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Samuel Goldstein's office, illuminating a very different environment from just a few weeks ago. The chaos of the previous days had been replaced by a determined calm, a renewed sense of purpose. Samuel was standing by the window, watching the waking city. Next to him, Leah and David were examining a series of documents spread out on the table. "So that's it," Samuel said, turning to face them both. "The Goldstein Corporation survived the storm." Leah smiled, tired but relieved. "Thanks to you, David. Without your help, we wouldn't have uncovered the conspiracy in time." David shook his head modestly. "It was a joint effort. We all played our part." Samuel approached, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Mr. Cohen." "David, I must admit that when I proposed that challenge months ago, I never imagined we'd get here. You've not only proved your worth, but you've saved this family and this company." "What happens now, Dad?" Leah asked, her voice laden with emotion. Samuel sighed deeply. "Michael will be judged, as will Sarah and Victor Roth. The company will need time to recover, but investors are coming back now that the truth has come out." "What about us?" David asked hesitantly, looking at Leah. Samuel smiled. "Something rare these days." "Well, I guess it's time to keep my end of the bargain, isn't it?" "David, you've more than proved yourself worthy of my daughter. You have my blessing." "If you still want it." Leah hugged her father, tears of joy in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot to us." David, overcome with emotion, held out his hand to Samuel. "Mr. Goldstein, I promise that I will do everything in my power to be worthy of this trust." Samuel ignored the outstretched hand, and to everyone's surprise, pulled David into a hug. "I know you will, son. And please, call me Samuel." Just then, Rachel entered the office carrying a tray with coffee and muffins. "I thought everyone could use a breakfast. We have a lot to celebrate after all." As they gathered around the table, enjoying the coffee and each other's company, the conversation flowed naturally into the future. "David," Samuel began, "I know your passion is art, but I'd like to offer you a position in the company. Your unique perspective and problem-solving skills would be invaluable." David looked surprised. I don't know what to say. It's a generous offer, but..." Leah intervened, smiling. "Why not both, love? You could work for the company part-time and still have time for your art. In fact, we could even think about a corporate art division." David's eyes lit up at the idea. That could work. "Samuel, what do you think?" Samuel nodded approvingly. "I think it's an excellent idea. The Goldstein Corporation could use a touch of creativity." As they discussed the details, it became clear that this was not just the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a new era for everyone involved. Hours later, when the sun was high in the sky, David and Leah were walking hand in hand through Central Park. "Are you happy?" Leah asked, looking at David lovingly. David smiled, squeezing her hand. "More than I ever thought possible." "And you?" "Immensely," she replied, "but also a little scared. So much has changed so quickly." David stopped, turning to face her. "Change isn't always bad, Leah. Look at us. A few months ago, I was just an artist struggling to make ends meet, and you were the reluctant heiress to an empire. Now, Now we're partners, Leah added, smiling, in life and in business. Exactly, David agreed, pulling her close. And that's just the beginning of our story. As they kissed, with New York City in the background, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Back at the office, Samuel looked at a family photo taken years ago when Michael and Leah were children. His heart ached for his son's betrayal, but he was also filled with hope for the future that lay ahead. New beginnings, he murmured to himself, putting the photo back on the table. For all of us. And so, as the sun continued its journey across the New York sky, the Goldstein family, now including David, prepared to write the next chapter of their story. A story of redemption, of second chances, and above all, of the transformative power of love and trust.